Hello, and thank you for joining us to discuss Phase 2 of the Rethink Transit study, led by the City of Everett with support from Everett Transit and our friends at Community Transit. This study looks at 3 options for future transit service in Everett, and we're asking for public input on these options. In a few minutes, we'll be joined by Everett Transit Director Tom Hingson and Community Transit Director of Planning and Development Roland Behee. They will share important information about each option and discuss potential funding, service, and transit oversight changes. Everett City Council will consider all options presented in this study. They have the authority to put forth one option to a public vote. Whichever option is chosen will be voted on by City of Everett residents. And to be clear, this is a decision Everett residents will make. It is not a county decision. If you're unable to stay with us the entire time, we encourage you to ask your questions in the comments section below and revisit this video as you have time. We'll be answering your questions in the second half of today's live stream. You'll find detailed information and a survey at the online open house link in the video description or at rethinket.participate.online. I'd like to start with a brief video that offers an overview of the project and the options we'll be discussing. After the video, we'll discuss each option in more detail and later answer your questions. As the City of Everett continues to grow over the next 20 years, the city has identified 3 funding options for transit services in Everett. Improving transit as the city grows provides important benefits across the community. This video explains how these options will affect transit services in Everett. The current funding option would allow Everett Transit to slowly restore some of the service cut during the COVID-19 pandemic, but would not provide enough revenue to keep up with the expected growth in jobs and population in Everett. Under this option, the sales tax rate would stay at 0.6%. The growth option would provide moderate growth in transit service over a 10-year period. This option would increase frequency of local bus service, expand operating hours in the mornings, evenings, and on weekends, and expand access to jobs in Everett. The funding level for this option would limit the ability of the transit system to provide adequate service in Everett as the city grows over the next 10 years. The current transit sales tax would be increased to 0.9%. The growth through consolidation option would involve merging Everett Transit with Community Transit. Major service improvements would be achieved within 2 years, and service would continue to grow as travel demand increases. It would increase bus routes and frequency of bus service, and provide the greatest access to jobs for Everett residents. This option would reduce walk time to bus stops and expand operating hours in the morning, evening, and on weekends. The current transit sales tax would increase to 1.2%. I'd like to welcome Tom and Roland. Thank you for joining us today. Let's jump into it. Tom, anytime we discuss changes surrounding service or fares, I receive questions about taxes. Do you mind quickly explaining how transit agencies like Everett Transit are funded and how the transit sales tax works?
Sure, Ryan, thank you. Transit sales tax in the state of Washington is funded by a voter-approved sales tax. It's authorized by the legislature. Currently, most transit agencies in the state have a limit of 0.9% or 0.9%. And we have been authorized by the state to have 0.6 as our voters approved that in 2004. Any change to that has to be approved by the voters, and any change other than the 0.9% would have to be approved by the legislature.
Great, thank you. So current funding, let's talk about the current funding option. I want to make this clear, when we're talking about this option, we're not talking about maintaining pre-COVID service levels. We're talking about maintaining our current service levels, correct?
That is correct.
All right. If we stay at the current funding level, what service changes, if any, can residents and customers expect to see over the next 5 to 10 years?
So the service level that we have now, we established with our last service change just a couple of weeks ago in March here. And we brought our services back up to about 75% of where we were in 2019, prior to the pandemic. The changes that we would expect to see at this rate would be moderate, very small changes, adjusting maybe 2 times a year as we normally do, adjusting for frequency of travel in some areas, or making some adjustments for how long the trip takes to keep the bus on schedule. We would watch closely to see if our sales tax was actually generating more revenue than we thought it would. And if that were the case, we'd look carefully at what more service we might be able to add that would be sustainable for, say, at least 10 years. We have a lot of plans of where we know we need service, so it wouldn't be difficult to add service if we had the ability to do so.
Great. That's great information. Thank you so much. As we look at the next two options, growth and growth through consolidation, it's important to note that proposed service changes are largely based on Everett Transit's long-range plan that was completed in 2019. If you're interested in reviewing this document, I've placed a link to our website in the description box below. I also need to comment, I think one thing we can all agree on is that through this pandemic, transit riders have told us how important transit is to them. For many, it's their only mode of transportation and essential to their livelihood. This decision that will be made by Everett City Council and voted on by residents of Everett will make a major impact on our community over the next 10 years, in addition to impacting traffic issues. With the second option, called growth, we would see a 0.3% sales tax increase along with service growth. This would take the transit sales tax from 0.6% to 0.9%, or 6 cents on every $10 purchase to 9 cents on every $10 purchase. Traffic is a major concern for many people living in Everett, and is likely to become worse as the economy recovers from the pandemic. The growth option increases frequency, expands service and operating hours, and increases access to jobs on Everett Transit, all of which may help people traveling in Everett avoid traffic congestion. So Tom, you're directly involved in Everett Transit service planning. Under the growth option, what is Everett Transit's plan to deliver more accessible and reliable service and increase ridership through Everett? And is there a timeline for this growth in service?
So shortly after a sales tax is approved, we don't get the money right away. It has to come in over a little bit of time. But our first step would be to begin hiring drivers, because you can't provide service without drivers. And so we would begin that right away. And as soon as we had drivers, the areas that we could add service to fairly quickly would be service on the weekends, service during the midday, during the weekday, and maybe a little service later in the evening and earlier in the morning. What we wouldn't be able to do is add more routes or more service frequency, more frequent service during the morning and afternoon commute times. And that is simply because we wouldn't have enough buses. We might have enough drivers, but we wouldn't have enough buses to add that level of increase. So I think what we would do is look at the areas where we know there's demand, where we get comments all the time. We know where people would like to have more service, when they would like to have more service, and we would focus on that first with what we're able to do with more drivers with the current amount of buses.
Great. So touching on that with this next question, what data are you and your team using to plan for the future? Is it solely based on comments that come in, or are we looking at demographic growth and working with the economic department to see what businesses or apartment buildings are coming in? What are you using to plan that transit service?
All the things that you mentioned, Ryan, as well as we go back to the long plan that was quite detailed in identifying areas of the community that are underserved, and we want to make sure that we address that as we grow. We saw areas that are potential for more growth, and we will be looking at that to see if that growth occurs as planned. We certainly, every plan for building in the city also goes to Everett Transit for comment. So we certainly want to make sure that if there's a major employer coming into the city, if there's a way for us to serve them with fixed route transit, we are at the table to try to help them to reduce their burden and also to improve our traffic around that new employer, if that would be the case. So all of those things would come into play, and then certainly we just have to make sure that we have the budget to provide whatever would be sustainable, and so all of those factors are taken into account.
Right. And you did mention the number of buses that we have with introducing new routes and all of that. How quickly could we increase our number of buses? And is there a cap on how many we can have? And how does that affect, putting new routes out there?
Well, we currently have 36 buses, and it takes about 18 months to get a new bus from the day that you order it. So there is that consideration. We're at the mercy of the manufacturer. We are committed to having all electric buses. So it's taking a little bit longer maybe for us to get an electric bus than it might be to get a diesel bus. But certainly you'd never get anything in less than a year. So we plan on 18 months for delivery on a bus. And then that is presuming that we have the finances to pay for that bus. So we wouldn't order a bus until we were certain that we could pay for it. And most of our vehicles, certainly the large majority, are paid for by state or federal grants. And we go through the process of competing for those dollars. And if we're successful, we would have enough money to buy buses. If we're not, then we might have to wait a little bit longer until we built up our cash flow to do that.
Right. I think that helps people understand where Everett Transit is at in the outreach that I've been doing. That's what I've heard is a lot more east-west connections to help, especially down in the south end, central and south end, to help connect those longer routes. My last question for you, Tom, here is there any kind of guarantee that riders will see these service increases with a tax increase?
If there is more resources, there will be an improvement in service. That would be the only reason we would ask for the resource increase. How quickly those increases in service would come would be all the factors that we talked about. Probably the easiest thing for us to do would be to recruit and employ more drivers. So the other things would take longer. And one thing I didn't really mention, but it's also a factor for us, is that even though I need more buses to increase the service, but I have room to park 36 buses today. And in order to increase the fleet, I also have to increase our bus base capacity and where we can park those buses. And that's actually a much longer and larger financial investment than buying a bus. So our longer range plan for significantly increasing the fleet would be not 18 months, it would be more like 5 years or more before we could have that facility built.
Great. I appreciate it, Tom. Thank you. The next option is the growth through consolidation, and this would mean that Everett Transit merges with the Regional Public Transportation Benefit Area Transit System, or Community Transit. With the merger comes several changes to the transit system, including potential route changes, funding and service oversight, and a doubling of the current transit tax. If it's okay with you, Roland, I'd like to explore these changes one by one.
Sure.
So first, service. Roland, under the growth through consolidation option, community transit plans to reach the base service level as shown in Everett Transit's long range plan as soon as 2024 and continue adding service as the area grows and the need is there. This puts community transit roughly 10 years ahead of Everett Transit's established long range plan goals. When discussing a merger, a question I often receive is what kind of guarantee do Everett Transit's residents and Everett Transit riders have that community transit will fulfill the essential transit service needs, meaning provide at least the same level of service that Everett Transit is providing today? And additionally, when would a potential service map be released to Everett residents to help understand how and where service would be provided in Everett?
Sure, Brian. So to your first question regarding the guarantee of service, or what's the level of certainty around that? Well, as Tom said, as resources are available, we would add service. And one thing that's important to understand with community transit is we serve most of Snohomish County. We have every city in Snohomish County with the exception of Everett. And we plan for services across that entire network of communities according to the demand for transit. And so some of the things that you talked about earlier in speaking with Tom, so where is population located? Where are jobs? Where are the major destinations that travelers need to get to in their daily lives? Those really determine how we allocate transit service. And when you look at Everett, Everett really checks all of those boxes. It's the central city. It has most of the government services, many of the major destinations that people throughout the county and within the city of Everett want to travel to. And it has the highest density of population and jobs. So just based on the demographics and economics, it's very clear that Everett would receive a high level of service. And that's the conceptual planning that we've undertaken over the last year as we've been participating in this study, is looking at that opportunity and understanding what that service plan would look like. Your second question, let me see if I'm calling here.
Just about where and when maybe a service map would be provided to Everett residents to review or see.
Yeah. So, as I said, the work to date has been relatively conceptual, although we clearly evaluated corridors within Everett, neighborhoods within Everett. We have a pretty clear sense of where service would be needed within the city. And if the process continues to move forward, and you've identified in your opening remarks that Everett City Council needs to evaluate options and then make a decision about what the next steps are in the process, should this continue to move forward to a ballot measure, at the point where there's action on that front, we would very clearly come forward with a service map and details of this proposal so that people had a clear understanding of what they were voting for.
Great. Thank you. So with the potential changes, including increased route frequency, expanded access to jobs in Everett, and extended operating hours, it seems like there's a lot of value being brought to our city in a short amount of time. I know that in the near future, community transit will also be expanding upon the BRT, or bus rapid transit lines, similar to Swift, Blue, and Green. So my question is, how much of this planned expansion would be new routes serving Everett versus extending and continuing pre-existing routes from both community transit and Everett Transit? An example being community transit's 201 and 202 and Everett Transit's Route 29.
Sure. Well, that's the real opportunity here. That the answer is really all of the above. In some cases, the best answer is to modify a community transit route that already serves the city. So your example of a 201 or 202 is in that category. So we would be able to add additional stops on those routes and provide access for Everett residents along routes where there's already a lot of service, a bus every 15 minutes today. In other cases, we would take routes that are currently near the city but don't enter the city, and we would extend those routes. There's an opportunity to restructure them and remove that boundary that's at the city line and carry people into destinations inside of Everett. So that eliminates a transfer, both for people that live outside of Everett and also for Everett residents to be able to get outside the city more easily. In some cases, it's taking Everett's existing routes and and adding service to those routes. So part of the plan would be to take current routes that may not serve 7 days a week or may provide a narrower range of service in terms of the operating hours, and to add service so that those routes would be available more hours of the day or more frequently. And in some cases, it's about extending those routes. So you gave an example of the 29. The 29 is an example of a route that could be extended south beyond the city limits to connect, for example, at Mariner Park and Ride or McCollum Park Park and Ride, to be able to access regional services at those locations. And in some cases, we've thought of brand new routes that don't exist today. So it's a little bit of everything that you've described, Brian.
Great. Thank you so much. So second is going to be taxes, and I'm sorry, my camera seems to have frozen. So with the merger, people paying taxes on purchases in Everett would see their transit sales tax portion raised from 0.6% to 1.2%, or 12 cents on every $10 purchase. Will you please explain why community transit collects at a higher tax rate and where that tax comes from and goes to?
Sure. Well, community transit is a public transit benefit area, and it works under the same framework that Tom described earlier in terms of it's a tax dedicated to transit, and citizens in the transit district vote on what level of tax it's at. Community transit is in Snohomish County, which is one of the fastest growing counties in the nation, really. And as population and employment have grown dramatically over our history, there are times when the demand for transit has exceeded the capacity that we have to provide it. And so we have asked the voters for more resource in order to increase their level of service. And they have supported that. In 2001, the voters supported an increase from 0.6 to 0.9 of a cent. And then again in 2015, voters supported an increase from 0.9 of a cent to 1.2 cents, and we sought authority of the state legislature to go above that previous 0.9 maximum. That's enabled us to expand services. Following the 2015 vote, we were able to add service on weekends and significantly enhance the service available 7 days a week. We added service in the evenings. We added service in the morning hours. We increased the frequency on a lot of routes, and we also deployed the Swift Green Line connecting Boeing and the Seaway Transit Center down to the Canyon Park Transit Center in Bothell, traveling around Everett and also crossing the Blue Line. So it's allowed us to invest in a lot of new services and keep up with travel demand in Snohomish County. And that's some of the same growth that Everett is facing in the next 2 decades, as regional projections have indicated. I think Everett's on track to absorb, 60,000 residents between now and 2050.
Great. Thank you. Tom, on that taxes, and I know you touched on it briefly, but another one that I often receive from people when referring to Everett Transit and taxes is, why doesn't Everett Transit increase the transit sales tax from 0.6% to 1.2% to fund more transit service? Do you mind explaining this?
Well, as Roland mentioned, community transit went to the state legislature to get permission to increase from 0.9 to 1.2. But we would have to ask for that same permission. But the logical question that we've already heard from the legislatures is, if you're willing to pay 1.2, why wouldn't you just consolidate with community transit? So you need a legislative sponsor for such an action. And to date, we have not met a legislative sponsor for such an action.
Okay. Thank you. And Roland, the third and maybe the biggest concern surrounding a merger is funding and service oversight. Currently, Everett Transit oversight comes from the mayor of Everett and Everett City Council, approving major service changes, fares, and receiving guidance on service needs from around the city of Everett. Community Transit's oversight comes from a board of directors whose 10 members are made up of city representatives from throughout Snohomish County. So do you mind explaining to everyone how moving from a city-focused oversight committee to a county-based oversight committee would affect Everett's opportunities for transit growth and having specific needs met?
Sure. So I think the first thing to mention is the statute would require that Everett be represented on that board. So there is a requirement for what's called proportional representation. Everett is the largest city in Snohomish County, and so Everett would have a voice, a consistent voice on that board. And you're correct, it's what's called a federated board with representatives from city and county government throughout our service area. And like I said, Everett would be represented in that. I think an important thing to understand throughout our 45-year history is that the board members, while they come from their various constituent jurisdictions, they really take a broad network view of their work at community transit. And as I described earlier, the way that we have allocated service throughout our history is based on demand. So there's a lot of attention paid to where are people living, where are they traveling to, where's the population, where are the jobs, where do populations live that rely on transit? So we look at where low-income populations might live, people who have limited access to car or maybe disabled, and that factors into where we deploy service throughout the district. And so it really is, it's much more on a needs basis and demand basis than it is along any specific jurisdictional lines or concerns of each individual member of that board. That's been true throughout our history. I think the other important point to make is that Community Transit's board is dedicated to transit. We are a transportation company. That is what we do, is mobility. And so, which is different than the city, where you have many other concerns to pay attention to, from utilities to land use to law enforcement, you name it. So that is a different approach. We have a board that is solely focused on the transportation needs of the member jurisdictions of the population of Snohomish County, including the city of Everett, should it become a part of that district.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for providing all that information today. I think this gives residents a clearer understanding of the transit options given to them and how critical the actual decision they'll need to make in the near future. If you don't mind, let's take a few minutes and answer any questions that may have come up from our viewers. And one that is right here, Tom, I think this will be directed at you. When it comes to adding buses for Everett Transit, would you be able to lease space to park additional buses while waiting on an operations center to build?
We would certainly look for a place to lease buses. We've done that in the past. There are some, operational concerns, but we wouldn't rule that out if that was what was holding us back. One issue, though, is that if those buses that are coming to us are electric, we also have to be able to plug those buses in and have a whole infrastructure for electric buses. And unlikely we would be able to find a lease arrangement that would allow us to do that. We're pretty familiar with all the places in the city where you can park large vehicles today, and there aren't a lot of choices within the city limits.
All right. So this one, I'm adding to the comment. It says, could ET and CT work on some options for shared maintenance, operations, and equipment storage as a way to provide flexibility without a complete merger?
I will only speak for Everett at this point. I say that, ET and CT have had a long relationship of working out various situations that have been mutually beneficial. I think we're both have some limitations at this point of, the spaces that we have available. So I would say that I'd certainly be open to any conversation that might work, but I also know that we both have our own limitations. You can take it from there, Roland.
Well, I would emphasize what Tom said, that we are already coordinating and cooperating on many levels. We have close integration and coordination with our paratransit services between the agencies. Everett is a partner in operation of our Swift Blue line within the city in terms of being a funding partner and also being a capital partner with the stations and terminal at Everett Station. And there is a lot of service planning coordination that goes on as we plan our respective networks. But there are some inherent efficiencies of a merged operation that really only become available when you're able to fully integrate that network in a fully merged way. And while there are some opportunities for us to partner and coordinate and cooperate, it's really with that fully integrated agency that you get the real opportunity to leverage the fleet that we already operate and own, the base facilities, that we are already underway with, with expanding and preparing for the arrival of Link Light Rail in 2024. So it really is, there are, I think, some opportunities, but also it's really about that integration between the two in the full sense that really opens up the opportunity for the efficiencies we've been talking about.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you again, both of you, for joining us and explaining through all the options and giving us some really valuable information. I really appreciate you guys being here. It looks like that's the end of the questions that have come up so far, but we'll be going through the comments and answering questions that pop up after the live stream is over. So thank you again, both, and have a great day. The last thing on today's agenda is letting you know about our online open house. A link is in the video description and a couple times in the comments section, as well as shown on screen right here. Please visit this website to take our survey and let Everett City Council know which option you support and share your thoughts. We appreciate your time and look forward to hearing from you all. Take care.